word sati, the Pali word sati, means remembering presence, being aware of what's going on in the moment. And as most of us know, when we most need it, when we're in traffic or when we're in engaged with our child and there's a lot of tension, or when there's an argument with a partner, or we're anxious about performance, we're overeating, a bag of trail mix, those are the times we most need mindfulness, and those are the times that it's absolutely like a million miles away, right? So the big question is, in this practice of remembrance, is how to remember, right? I mean, we know that. I was reflecting on this, and I remember one of my father's favorite little stories of a elderly couple, and they're having an amiable conversation, and one says to the other, "Hey, Fred, so how was your experience with the memory clinic?" And Fred said, "Oh, it was great. They taught us all sorts of cool tricks, association and visualization." And his friend says, "That's great. What's the name of the clinic?" Fred goes blank, and he's thinking and thinking, and finally this broad smile crosses his face. He goes, "What's that flower with the long stem and the thorns?" And his friend says, "Rose." He goes, "Hey, Rose, what was the name of that clinic that..." I heard that one a lot growing up. So we need a way to remember. I mean, we need a certain amount of mindfulness to be mindful. And many of you are familiar with the acronym RAIN, R-A-I-N. And it's a strategy for cultivating and applying mindfulness that's really easy to remember, to kind of, okay, let's just RAIN. Teachers have been sharing this now for probably over 20 years. And I find that this acronym is so helpful. I've ended up sharing it so regularly that I really wanted to dedicate a talk to diving in some more and looking at the elements of it and some of the challenges that come up, and have a little time so that we can do a full guided RAIN meditation together. Apply it. I'll be asking you to pick someplace you get stuck that you'd like to have a little more mindfulness holding. So a little bit of background on RAIN. The acronym was first coined by a senior Vipassana teacher, Michelle McDonald. Again, I think it was about 20 years ago. The version that I've been teaching for the last, now it's probably about 12 years, expands on the original in a very specifically. I added an explicit emphasis on kindness, because that wasn't in the original acronym, an emphasis on a kind of intimate attention, quality of attention. And I also kind of expanded what the investigation means. So we'll get into that in a bit. But I found that both for students, for anybody working with difficulty, for clinicians helping their patients and clients, that the acronym is really impactful. So to begin with, the elements of the acronym RAIN are, the R is to recognize, which means to, and I'll go through them very carefully in a little bit, but recognize means to notice what's going on in the moment. You can name it, like, oh, fear, confusion, anger, whatever it is, just recognize it. The A of RAIN is to allow it, which means don't try to get rid of it. It's almost like this pause where you make space and let be for the time being. Just allow it. You just let it be as it is. The I of RAIN, once you've allowed it, you can sink in a little more, is you say, okay, so investigate. What is going on here? So you begin to explore the dimensions of the experience. You say, okay, how does this feel? And is there something I'm believing right now about myself? And what's the actual sensations of the experience? So you kind of go in more. But if you do that and you don't have an attitude of friendliness or kindness, the investigation can actually have a tinge of judgment or aversion. So the I, when you're investigating, also includes a kind of intimate attention where you're really offering a quality of gentleness or friendliness. That's R-A-I. The N, there's nothing that you're doing with the N. The N is the fruit of the R-A-I, with the recognizing and allowing and investigating and offering this kindness. There's a quality of presence that ends up unfolding that is the N. There's a shift in identity where you're no longer the beleaguered self, the victimized self, the angry self, the fearful self. There's a sense of resting in that presence that is caring, open, awake, tender. There's a shift in your sense of who you are. That's the N, and the N is not identified. You're not identified with the kind of narrow, egoic, reactive self. But you can also think of the N, some of you might prefer that you've come back to your natural, loving awareness. You're back in the wholeness of your being. So those are the elements, and I'll give you some examples of how it works, and we'll practice. But I'd like to first kind of describe almost in terms of the dynamics of it, how that works. And one of my favorite ways of understanding rain comes from Dan Siegel, who's a neuropsychologist, and he says, he takes the hand like this, and he says, okay, you're going to think of your wrist as your spinal cord that's going into the skull. It's your brain stem, okay? And then he takes the thumb and he says, this is the limbic system, fight, flight, freeze, and so on. And then the fingers over it, we've got the whole brain now, the frontal cortex, okay? So brain stem, limbic system, frontal cortex. So this is our brain. And generally when the way things work is information flows up and then it flows down through there's information going up, and then the frontal cortex regulates and sends more information down. But what happens when there's too much stress is you can flip your lid, right? So that what happens is you no longer have the value of the frontal cortex feeding down information like, hey, let's get some perspective on things, and yes, this has happened before, but you've worked it out, some humor, some wisdom, mindfulness. Okay, let's just notice what's happening. All of that is the frontal cortex. We no longer have access when we flipped our lid. Okay? So what intentional mindfulness does is it notices that, because there's still some mindfulness that's naturally part of who we are, and it begins to name what's going on and allow what's going on and activate the frontal cortex so it's re-engaged and we're back in an integrated system. Isn't that cool? So that's how it works. I mean, rain, this arousing of presence with the recognizing, allowing, investigating, actually re-engages the frontal cortex. And with that, when I say frontal cortex, the whole network that's described as the compassion network, and then that larger viewing of mindfulness. So I also like to think of rain in the more poetic way. If you think of the rain coming down from the skies, it's the sky is sky of awareness and this rain of attention, and that when we're caught in a tight space, there's this nourishment that comes from the heavens that helps us to soften and open, and it helps us to, again, grow into our fullness. So many of you, maybe when you hear the acronym for the first time, as I did, one of the first thoughts was of Shakespeare, and the quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven, right? So when we're suffering, the freedom doesn't come from a strained effort. The freedom we don't fight our way out of the box. There's actually this gentle rain of attention that we offer to what's happening. And in that gentle attentiveness, we begin to reopen and re-inhabit the fullness of our being. We have access again to our resources. Or back to the scientific way, we have access to the frontal cortex. So let's explore a little bit about when rain is needed. And the broad response to that is anytime we're stuck in a small place where we're caught in an egoic sense of something's wrong, I'm endangered, I'm threatened, I'm going to lose something, I've lost something, some sense of tightness or smallness. And there's many different ways that could happen. We might be caught in a conflict and be in the kind of reactivity where we're lashing out, and it might feel very familiar. And I'm going to name a few different versions of where rain can come in, because I want you to be thinking about how you'd like to apply it in your own life tonight when we practice. So perhaps you have a situation in your life where you just very easily get tripped off into, in some way, being aggressive or hostile or judgmental. It's perfect to practice on your own. Just rerun it, stop it where you're feeling reactive, and then start practicing rain. An alleged radio conversation between a U.S. naval ship and Canadian authorities. This is what was recorded. Americans say, please divert your course 15 degrees to the north to avoid a collision. Canadians say, recommend you divert your course 15 degrees to the south to avoid a collision. The Americans, this is the captain of the U.S. Navy ship. I say again, divert your course. The Canadians, no. I say again, you need to divert your course. The Americans, sternly. This is the aircraft carrier USS Lincoln, the second largest ship in the United States Atlantic Fleet. We are accompanied by 3 destroyers, 3 cruisers, and numerous support vessels. I demand that you change your course 15 degrees north. That's 15 degrees north. Our countermeasures will be undertaken to ensure the safety of this ship. Canadians, this is a lighthouse. Your call. Okay, so we take the elements now and just slow it down and really look at what they mean. The recognizing and allowing is really the heart of mindfulness. Mindfulness is really noticing what's happening moment to moment without any judgment. We're just letting it be there. So that's the core piece of rain. And you might think of it in terms of 2 questions. And one is, what is happening right now? The recognizing has the question, what's really happening? If you ask yourself right now, you close your eyes and say, well, what's going on inside me right now? And you might try it. And you'll notice that the question directs your attention in a way that there's a little more contact with what's going on inside you right now. So recognizing the questions, what's happening or what's going on inside me, and then there's a naming that really helps us to connect and contact the experience. And as I mentioned before, you might say what's happening inside me right now, and you might say restlessness or anxious, or my mind's obsessing. It's hard to even feel what's happening in my body. But you just name it. That's the recognizing. The second question, you've asked what's happening, is, can I be with this? That's for allowing. What's happening? Can I be with this? So if you come out of tonight and all you remember is the R and the A, what's happening? Can I be with this? But more and more you pause and ask those questions, you'll be more awake. Okay? All right, so we ask those 2 questions, and to note that the recognizing and allowing creates a pause. That instead of tumbling into our reactive behavior, whether it's eating a bowl of ice cream or lashing out through an email that's, judgmental or whatever it is, we've paused. And as many of you know, one of my favorite quotes from Viktor Frankl is, between the stimulus and the response, there is a space. And in that space is your power and your freedom. If you can pause in the midst of a chain of, very familiar habitual activity, you have more choice. Okay? So the R and the A create a pause. And then they enable you to begin to investigate. Now, just to say that there are all different degrees of recognizing and allowing. You might recognize and notice, oh, I'm angry, and okay, let it be. Take a few breaths and try to go in, and it may be very, very glancing. Or you might recognize and really get it, and really allow, really let it be there. And then there'll be much more potential for investigating. We just, whatever level we go to, we go to. So then we begin to investigate with interest and friendliness. One of my favorite stories that really kind of brings to life what it means to investigate our experience comes from a film, Gorillas in the Midst. And some of you might have seen it, because in this film, Diana Fossey is shown to be this amazing field biologist. And she followed in the footsteps. Her mentor was George Shaler. He's a primate biologist who would go into the wilds and come back with amazing information about the lifestyle and habits of gorillas. So between them, they were able to really outline their tribal structure and their family life and the intimate habits. And when asked how he was able to investigate and gather all this information, he attributed to just one thing. He said, I didn't carry a gun. That previous generations of biologists had gone into the wilds with, toting these guns, and these very peaceful creatures had kind of felt that energy and not revealed their habits. So I feel like this really gives us a window into the spirit of mindfulness, and in particular, the attitude that we can bring when we investigate. That it's not judgmental. It's really that we're just the way you'd want to get to know a new friend. It's like, what is really happening? It's an extension of that question with the R. What's this really like? How am I experiencing this? It's a genuine quality of interest with the investigating. And what we're investigating really are different domains of our reaction. I mean, when I'm investigating, I'm both investigating, what's the feeling and the sensations going on? And I'll sometimes ask, well, what am I believing right now? And often right away, I'll go, oh, I'm believing that I'm falling short. Or I'm believing that that other person doesn't like me. It'll be right there. So one domain, what am I believing? But then come back to the body. The big domain of investigation, when we're out in the fields and looking at these wild creatures of our being, is the felt sense. The felt sense is where it's at. The more you can investigate and sense the quality of sensations and the atmosphere in your body and what's moving and where it is, the more you'll understand the whole dynamic of what's going on. Now, as I said, if you're just investigating, but there's in the background some judgment, there's a gun, it won't work. The parts of you that are most vulnerable and most need attention will hide in the shadows. So I'll say that again, if there's judgment, when you're investigating, it won't work. The only thing that dissolves the judgment that we have in such great supply is a very purposeful quality of gentleness and kindness. And hence, with the eye of investigating, it's a double eye. It's investigate with an intimate attention. Okay? Does that make sense? I mean, imagine if your child came home from school after being bullied and you wanted to find out what happened. The only way you'd be able to find out is if you created a space that was safe and kind, so that the child felt like telling you. Well, there's parts of us that feel wounded, and the only way that we'll get in touch with that rawness or tenderness is if there's an intention to be kind. You can't manufacture kindness, but you can intend it because your wisdom understands that that's really what's needed. You can intend it. there's an understanding that whatever we can't in some way embrace with love or kindness imprisons us. It'll stay hidden and stay in control. And another way this was put was a wonderful yoga teacher once said, put your right arm over your left and hug yourself. And she said, and then put your left arm over your right and hug your evil twin. So, what we've named so far, recognize, okay, what's happening, and then the allowing, let it be there, just pause. And then we're deepening the attention, let's investigate. How does this feel? Is there a belief about life that's playing into this and looping around? What's really the felt sense in the moment? There's other questions you can ask. One question I'll often ask is, what does this part of me need? What is it wanting? So you're ending up investigating by communicating in a way. But again, beware of going into thinking, because the information's embodied. That's where the mileage will come from. So then we have developed this presence with. That's what it is. It's presence with what's going on. And that is what unfolds itself as the N of rain. And we start to realize, oh, the what I am is not that self that was angry or victimized or whatever. It's this experience of presence and kindness, loving awareness. And that's the gift or blessing of rain. Sometimes I use this metaphor of that we come into life, we incarnate, and because life is challenging and stressful, we all very naturally develop a spacesuit to get through. And the egoic self, or the spacesuit that's kind of controlling and navigating, is quite natural. The challenge is that we start identifying with the spacesuit and we forget who's looking through the mask. We forget that tender wakefulness of heart. And we get identified with the defenses and the strategies. So what rain does when we get identified in that, and there's a kind of that rigidity, that edginess of ego, rain does that gentle rain from the heavens, is it starts softening and creates more of a kind of porous transparency to the spacesuit, so we can remember the goodness and awareness and love that's here. Doesn't get rid of the spacesuit. We're not trying to get rid of the ego. We're just trying to remember that who we are is not limited to the egoic self. And that's really important to remember. It's a homecoming to a larger sense of being. A couple of other comments on using rain in this way. One is that you might do a round of rain and it might not get to N. I have a lot of people that say, oh, I did it, but I just didn't get to N. I was recognizing and allowing it some, beginning to investigate, but it still was there. And so sometimes we don't get somewhere, and almost it's part of what's important is not to have a goal of getting to the end, but more the intention and the valuing of pausing and deepening our attention. And you can trust anytime you're caught in an old pattern and you pause, and even just for a few moments say, well, what's going on? And can I be with this? That you're beginning a rewiring, that the neurocircuitry is beginning to change. You are changing habits, even with the most lightest version of an incomplete rain, okay? Mindfulness helps, and this is mindfulness. Now, a few other challenges people come up with in doing this, and one of the big ones is I make a big emphasis with the investigation to come to the felt sense. But what if you check in and you can't find any felt sense? In fact, you can't really feel your body very well. So what I would encourage with the investigating is to just invite the feelings to be there and notice what happens, and don't worry if you can't connect with your body. Scan through your body, try to notice, but just putting out the inquiry. What's happening? How does this feel? Where do I feel this? And doing that over and over again, the invitation is what counts. The intention's what counts. You're beginning to bring attention to what's there, and it will unfold itself as it's meant to. Like there's these little beeps that are coming to accentuate the point. All right, I'm going to give you one more example, and then I'd like to practice together. And this example is one some of you might remember from my life, and it's an example of when the patterning is very, very deep and emotional and challenging. And one of the most important rain experiences I had was somewhere in the midst of being pretty sick, because I was pretty ill for about 8 years on and off during that time. And at one point, I had injured myself, and I was kind of out of things for a couple of weeks, and pretty physically uncomfortable, and just miserable, like kind of pessimistic, and just in a bad mood. So I, sometimes ask that question, what's between me and really being at peace with how it is? And I started meditating, and then realized that I was in a really irritable kind of state of mind. So I did rain more formally. And I would recognize and allow that, okay, I'm irritable, I'm miserable, I'm unhappy, let it be there. And it was just a big swamp. But as I started to investigate, I asked that question, what am I believing? And it wasn't about the sickness, it was something is basically wrong with me, and it's for how I'm being a bad patient, a bad sick person. So it wasn't just that I was sick, but I didn't like the kind of sick person I was becoming. I didn't like my self-centeredness. And just to unpack that a little, there was a sense like, well, I teach about equanimity and being the ocean and having these waves come and go, and here I am completely swamped by the waves and in a bad mood. I'm not being true to what I'm teaching. I'm getting really caught, and I'm being kind of narrow-minded and no fun to be around. So I was down on myself. When I saw that belief, oh, something's wrong with me, then I could feel into my body, and there was shame. It was a sense of kind of a hollow, achy, feeling that I just wanted to disappear. And I kept investigating, but as I investigated, I put my hand on my heart. And I find, for me, the intimacy part of rain really helps to have a very light touch on the heart. It's as if I'm keeping company in a kind way. And I sense that place that felt so ashamed just wanted some message of kindness. So I often use these words, it's okay, sweetheart, some message of kindness. Recognize, allow, investigate, bring an intimate attention. And as I sat and breathed and sent that kind of message in, there was an opening. There was more space, more tenderness. And again, it's what I call a real shift in identity from the egoic self that felt sick and miserable and bad about herself or how she was being sick and miserable, to a space of presence and kindness. That's the gift. So what that story, the reason I share that story, is a very important ingredient when you're practicing rain. And when there's a lot of stickiness, is the quality of self-compassion. And the more active it is, and the more full it is, the more the knots untangle, and there's a resting in something larger.